Great, thanks James for that introduction. So if I can just add a note on 3 degrees, we're a globally established climate solutions provider, supporting companies in taking action against climate change with solutions across scopes 1, 2 and 3. We're a B Corp and we're a team of experts who are all really passionate about our impact. So it's great to be speaking here today, and thanks everybody for joining us. So I'd like to start by setting the scene with what a lot of your organisations across the healthcare industry are facing here in 2026. So we know that key sustainability drivers are currently ramping up. We have regulations such as CSRD and CBAM starting to have an impact, and there's increasing attention from end consumers and the media around responsible businesses and ethical products. We know that we're approaching 2030 faster than any of us would like, and the time has come for businesses in all sectors and all market positions to start prioritising taking scalable action, doing everything within your power to reduce and remove emissions, even if your emissions accounting perhaps isn't quite perfect. And if you're still relying on estimates and assumptions and you're still missing primary data, trust me, so is everybody else. We know that there's been a real shift that to some extent is actually unique to healthcare, that you're collaborating more closely with your suppliers, with your customers, and with your peers, and that brings new potential for taking action together as a group. But there are still a lot of pain points when it comes to your scope 3. And in this webinar, we want to challenge you to think slightly differently about your supply chain, and then to give you some new tools to tackle these hurdles. So firstly, you may have a great relationship with some of your major tier 1 suppliers, but emissions hotspots are often much higher up in the value chain, where you don't have quite such good visibility, traceability, or influence. Secondly, many deep decarbonisation actions in API and chemical manufacturing rely on changing machinery and processes, which can mean huge investments. Change is often restricted or delayed by the highly regulated nature of the industry. And in some regions, so India and Ireland, for example, the local grid infrastructure isn't ready to support large-scale electrification. And thirdly, with major updates to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Science Based Targets Net Zero Standard, both taking a really long time, it's hard to work within the rules when you don't know what the rules are going to be. We'll talk about that as well. So we'll talk about some kind of new and innovative solutions to some of these problems shortly. But just for the next couple of minutes, I want to take a step back and to challenge how we all think about the value chain and value chain emissions, and hopefully propose something a little bit different. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the emissions breakdown for a typical or representative pharmaceutical company. So here's scope 1, 2, and major scope 3 categories, and a kind of conventional way that we'd look at emissions within the supply chain, so looking at the large yellow goods and services area here, is by segmenting it into products and activities. So for this company, those purchased goods and services emissions come primarily from APIs and manufacturing, with elements from packaging and R&D and other services. And then to break down this large API wedge, we can look at the next tier up and see that in this case, for this company, emissions hotspots include chemicals and solvents, intermediate materials, and equipment manufacturing. Hopefully some of this is looking familiar to some of you. You could keep going up and up through the supply chain doing this. And this is a really useful exercise. So by doing this, we know what we're buying, where the key emissions hotspot sits, where our key suppliers are, and gives you really good visibility of what's going on. Now, if we're thinking about encouraging and incentivizing suppliers to reduce their emissions, another different useful approach to consider is level of engagement. So you've probably spent some time thinking about your purchasing power, your contracting structures and relationships, and the resources required to engage with different suppliers. So in this example, we've identified some strategic partners, which we can work really closely with, some smaller engaged suppliers where perhaps we could introduce requirements for data reporting or target setting, perhaps writing things like that into contracting terms. And then we have 2 groups where your level of engagement and therefore your level of influence is likely to be much lower. And that's still in tier 1, but your long tail of suppliers and your upstream vendors in tiers 2, 3, and higher. A third way of breaking down your value chain is remembering that in the end, all emissions come from a small number of sources. So no matter the size of the company, what activities it does, where in the world it's based, emissions will ultimately come from fuels, including natural gas, electricity, fugitive emissions, or land use. And for pharmaceutical companies, when you go up through the tiers of the value chain and separate out scopes 1 and 2 at each tier, we find that sort of mapping this for a number of companies, ultimately between a quarter to a third of emissions come from natural gas, and likely over a third of emissions, up to nearly half of your total emissions, can be from electricity. So this way of breaking down your value chain is kind of uncommon, but the reason it's really powerful is because all of these companies have the same emission sources, and therefore all of these companies are trying to do the same few things. Everybody wants to use more renewable electricity. Everybody wants to decarbonize their processes and heating. And everybody wants to do this in a transparent and credible way. And for the rest of this session, we're going to take each of these points in turn and look at practical actions you can take to increase the impact that you have throughout your value chain. And at this point, I'll hand over to my colleague Matea, and you'll hear more from me later. Thanks.
Thank you, Jo. So yeah, let's just dive into it then, and really tackle the first point that you presented. So how do we actually increase renewable electricity share in the supply chain beyond what we've managed to achieve so far? And most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the concept of supplier engagement. You've either been the engager or the engaged, or even both. There are many ways companies can engage with their suppliers, and many tools in the supplier engagement toolbox we won't get into in this webinar. But it is important to note that this approach to supply chain decarbonization is widely acknowledged as the gold standard. And because it has been around for a while and tried and tested, we do know some of its limitations as well. Namely, it is resource intensive, it takes time, and it's most effective with stable tier 1 suppliers. So in trying to address the long tail of small suppliers or higher supply chain tiers, the cost and resources needed for supplier engagement tend to outweigh the impact. So what we're proposing is adding another tool to your decarbonization toolkit, procuring renewable electricity on your supplier's behalf to address areas of the supply chain that have limited transparency and where you have limited influence. And before you think of all the reasons not to consider this initiative, I ask you to keep an open mind and consider all the benefits I'll go into in a moment. Firstly, we found this approach when underpinned by a robust methodology to show impactful results in a much shorter time frame than supplier engagement alone. 3 Degrees has developed such a methodology in collaboration with Google and Meta, and the full guidance can be found on our website. SBTi progress data shows that the annual emissions decrease for scope 1 and 2 targets is around 7%. And for companies with separate scope 3 targets, that figure is 3%. And this is not nearly enough to get us where we need to be. So for a typical healthcare value chain, we've seen electricity may account for almost a third of total scope 3 emissions. And a significant part of that could be addressed more effectively through direct procurement. Of course, direct procurement is not as simple as buying unbundled certificates in any market and accounting for the reductions in your inventory. Following a credible methodology to identify electricity load within your value chain and match it with appropriate certificates while maximizing impact and maintaining high degrees of credibility is really key to making those credible and transparent claims. While the benefits beyond those shorter timeframes that I've mentioned also include taking fewer, more efficient actions, which in turn, of course, translate to reduced costs versus traditional supplier engagement. These can be seen in lower admin costs and also avoiding pass-through costs from your suppliers. Also, you can achieve reductions across multiple supply chain tiers, those that cannot really be reached by supplier engagement. And in addition, direct procurement may better position you to ask your suppliers for things like future time-bound commitments to procure renewable electricity, additional sustainability commitments, and also provision of primary data to support internal inventory calculations. So now that we've seen the benefits, how do we put this into practice? Our methodology follows 5 practical steps to implementation. Of course, this is a high-level kind of representation of those steps, but I do invite you to have a look for yourself. Starting with strategy and planning, a company should identify specific Scope 3 emissions to target, prioritizing areas where electricity is a major emission driver, for example, API manufacturing. It is with those focus areas that we then need to understand the amount of electricity that goes into that process and estimate where this consumption is occurring. Once you have that information, you will need to develop a tailored procurement strategy that will seek to both maximize impact, but also keep costs optimized. And it is really this strategy step that then guides the next one, which is the procurement. What follows is the quantification and application of updated emission factors that reflect the applied renewable electricity, successfully demonstrating a reduction in your targeted Scope 3 emissions. And finally, you should clearly disclose your methodology, boundaries, assumptions, and also state in your reporting that this approach relies on a methodology not yet explicitly addressed by the current greenhouse gas protocol. This ensures credibility while also allowing you to demonstrate meaningful near-term Scope 3 progress despite complex supply chains. So now that we've tackled one massive piece of the value chain puzzle, we will shift our focus to the second piece that Joe introduced us at the beginning of this webinar, which is options for heat decarbonization. And so I just wanted to take a little bit of a step back because I do think that this is a new area for most of us, and really just to kind of set the scene. With regards to the pharma sector, natural gas plays really a critical role across manufacturing, empowering multiple areas of operations. So we see it as playing an important role in providing process heat. So one of the largest demands used for things like concentration, evaporation, and such. Then we also have hot water and steam generation for maintaining hygienic conditions in manufacturing. Natural gas is also used as for maintenance of precise temperature, humidity, and air quality conditions. And lastly, of course, if we move beyond energy, natural gas is also a really important chemical input. By replacing natural gas use with biomethane, you are able to achieve emission reductions without infrastructure overhaul or changing your manufacturing processes. This means achieving your climate ambition while reducing impact, as well as providing your customers with low carbon products. Biomethane reduces exposure to EU emission trading system and the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and can even offer price and supply sustainability under specific contract structures. Now, to actually unlock these benefits, what we need is a credible, traceable instrument, and that's exactly where the biomethane guarantees of origin come in. So while many of you are familiar with electricity GOs from renewable power procurement, biomethane GOs work in some importantly different ways. This makes biomethane procurement more challenging than what we've become accustomed to. And on the next slide, let's look at the key characteristics of a biomethane GO and how it compares to its electricity counterpart, simply to understand a little bit more about how procurement might work. So starting with the key difference, the electricity GO's core attribute comes from the technology used to generate the renewable electricity, while for biomethane, we differentiate feedstock used in its production. So biomethane tends to either be crop or waste-based, and they're not always interchangeable. Both power and biomethane GOs, or their use, have limitations around things like double counting, geographical and temporal use, although they do not necessarily perfectly align. However, biomethane GEOs, when accompanied by a proof of sustainability certificate, also shows the carbon intensity of the biomethane produced or procured. And carbon intensity can be really relevant under certain schemes and PCF calculations by impacting procurement volume that is needed to achieve your goals. While biomethane GEOs can be purchased and used entirely unbundled from the gas molecule, the overwhelming use cases still require delivery to the local grid where consumption occurs. Biomethane GEOs are very much a way to ensure mandatory and voluntary compliance under the likes of EU ETS or CDP, and SBTi seems to be opening the door for their use to achieve net zero, at least in the interim. So it's safe to say that while accounting treatment and credible claims around biomethane GEO use are firmly established in the mandatory compliance space, they're still evolving in the voluntary space. They can also differ significantly between frameworks. On the other hand, we have power GEOs that have at least until recently been firmly established for Scope 2 decarbonization, and their use for making Scope 3 decarbonization claims is yet to be addressed. We, of course, have also seen some evolution in the Scope 2 space with power GEOs as well, with introduction of stricter market boundary definitions and time matching requirements. And the biomethane market itself is still in the younger sibling phase to renewable electricity, and as such, navigating it tends to be more challenging. So as you can see, biomethane procurement is a different and more complex exercise, and this is why supplier engagement and, more importantly, supplier support matters when we want to achieve heat decarbonization in the supply chain. Getting biomethane into your supply chain will require your active participation. And in the next slides, I want us to explore some of those first steps that you can take. So the natural first step really is building on top of your existing supplier engagement program, leveraging its infrastructure and your internal know-how. And this will most often look like implementing a system of incentives and penalties around heat decarbonization. But be mindful that biomethane supply and credible market mechanisms are not as widespread as renewable electricity, which may make adoption slower. Secondly, helping your supply chain develop the skills needed to plan, execute, and account for biomethane procurement. But here you really need to expect a steeper learning curve, which tends to mean more time and resources. And lastly, providing access to tools and expert advice that facilitates procurement and assures alignment between you and your supplier on the needed biomethane characteristics, especially since solutions tend to be more tailored and costly than with what we're used to seeing in renewable electricity procurement. So once you've done the hard work of engaging your suppliers, the next question really becomes, how do you claim and report those reductions in a credible way?
In this final section, I'd like to talk about how to credibly report the impact of your actions at a time when, as Matea mentioned, the current guidance doesn't address a lot of the emerging mechanisms, and we're in this period of uncertainty as the core framework's undergoing major updates. A key message that we're really advocating at 3 Degrees and that we're hearing from across the industry is that uncertainties in the guidance and nuances in reporting should absolutely not be a reason to delay in taking real action against climate change. So, the standards landscape. Our market insights team are closely following and consulting on the updates to both the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the new Science-Based Targets Initiative corporate net zero standard. And although there's a lot in both frameworks which still needs to be defined, we can see a clear direction of travel and areas of alignment between the two. So the expectation is that the effort and resources required for scopes 1 and 3 will be elevated to bring them more in line with how scope 2 has historically been treated, which is that it's got a higher level of focus or rigor attached to it. So scope 1 will most likely be separated from scope 2 and require its own targets under the new SBTi standard. And there's undoubtedly going to be a large emphasis on primary activity data and phase out of spend-based estimates within scope 3. Moving on to point 2 on this slide. Currently, market-based mechanisms are not addressed by the GHG protocol outside of scope 2. And this leaves a lot of uncertainty for companies using contractual instruments. But this is definitely expected to be allowable in the upcoming guidance. And we're anticipating guidance from the GHG Protocol's Action and Market Instruments Technical Working Group, which is expected in 2027, which will explicitly permit the use of market-based mechanisms, most likely reported via a parallel contractual inventory. Similarly, in the latest SBTI draft standard, there are references to the use of market-based mechanisms. So one of the Scope 3 target setting options specifically refers to the use of commodities environmental attribute certificates, as long as they're from the same activity pool, so meaning the same network or the same physical area that you're sourcing from. Of course, until the final guidance from both are released, we can't be quite sure what's happening, but it's definitely some clear messaging in the direction there. Point 3 is that we expect multi-ledger accounting to become the norm. This is an extension of the current location-based and market-based dual reporting system for electricity, but it's on a much more extensive scale. So this introduces different ways of credibly reporting different types of actions, and therefore allowing much more flexibility for companies. So the future looks good in terms of allowing for a wider range of credible, scalable corporate actions. But right now, under the existing core frameworks, there's still this uncertainty and unease around the applicability of market-based mechanisms. So I'd want to just introduce some guardrails you can use to make sure that your chosen strategy is credible and defendable in the short term. So firstly, although GHGP and science-based targets have some gaps, there are a range of detailed and powerful supplementary tools which build on the basis of GHG protocol and provide deeper technical evidence and more sort of specific solutions advice. So we could probably do a whole webinar on each of these things, but for now I just want to kind of make sure that you're aware of them all, emphasize that these are really great resources and are becoming widely adopted across multiple industries. Secondly, a reminder of what Matteo introduced, that using market-based mechanisms for Scope 3 decarbonisation isn't simply a case of going to buy EACs in your local market. By following an established, detailed methodology, you can make sure this is done in an impactful and, crucially, an auditable way. And there's this publicly available white paper, which sets this out in detail, which 3 Degrees produced in collaboration with Google and Meta, and that clearly sets out a robust and auditable approach. Final step is, of course, to be transparent in your reporting. Publicly disclose your methodology, your assumptions, and any limitations alongside your emission statement. And acknowledge if you're using an approach that's not currently addressed by the GHG protocol, and reference any other supplementary tools you've used, like TCAT or the AIM platform. So before we open for questions, I'd just like to draw together some of the threads that we've discussed. Right at the start, we looked at these 3 sector-wide challenges. And with these in mind, we've introduced a few solutions to build upon and extend your existing Scope 3 strategies and potentially provide some ideas for Scope 1 and 2 as well.